All right, it looks like folks are starting to log on. Welcome, 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 everybody. Feel free to unmute yourselves and say hello if you'd like to.
Hello.
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 May want to come around.
Hey,
Hello, good evening, everyone.
How are ya?
Hello.
Yeah.
Howdy.
In the picture, Barb.
I know I'm not.
I'm not?
Hi, Barb.
Which Barb? Is there more than one Barb? Probably.
More than one Barb.
I'm sure there are.
More than one Barb, and there's going to be a few name duplicates, I'm sure. No, at least a few that we're going to see tonight. So. Well, welcome. I think we've got, how many folks are in here so far? Give everybody a few more minutes to get in here just so that we're all starting at the same time because it is 7:01. And let's give folks maybe 2 or 3 more minutes to get here before we start saying hellos and welcomes.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you guys. Yeah, go ahead and turn your microphones on if anyone wants to say hello.
We actually have two
Two sets.
in one location.
Aha.
Camera's not working well. Well, they're waiting for 20 people and only 19 show. Here, let's squeeze over. Yeah, I think we got pushed.
What? Oh my God.
No, that's okay.
Oh my God. No, that's okay. Are we good now? Are we good now? We're good?
All right, looks like most folks are here.
I have a mouse, but it eats up the battery so fast.
I think it's fine to start, Katie.
I'm not sure that.
7:02, Mel, I'm going to give everyone a minute or two more to get everyone to log in. But what I will say first and foremost is if everybody has not already turned the view for the Zoom to gallery view from speaker view, if you go to the top right corner where there's a little square that says view, you tap that, you hit gallery, you'll be able to see everybody who's participating instead of just whoever's speaking. And that I think will make the discussion aspect of this a whole lot better and easier for everybody. So if you haven't shifted over to gallery view, I'm going to go ahead and recommend you do so. We are going to have obviously a presentation aspect of this, which will kind of take over your screens and show that, but that way it won't be, whoever's dog is barking or whoever's wrestling papers suddenly is in your screen and taking over it all.
Click on that. And there's gallery.
Oh. Well, she said in the other.
Yeah.
Top, it's a view up there too.
Yeah, she wrote where she sits in.
I don't really care if I have pictures.
Right. Has everybody figured out how to get into gallery view versus speaker view? Awesome.
You're good.
All right, so we've got about 25 people here. I'm going to give people a little bit longer to join us before we jump all the way into this tasting. But I do want to say welcome. Thanks for joining us. And we're so glad you were all able to make it. My name is Katey Cochran. A lot of familiar faces here, obviously, because we have a lot of returning people to our virtual tasting series. This is installation number 5, the 3rd one for this year. And we've had a really fun time tasting and chatting with you all about these wines and kind of digging into some niche varieties that we do, some specialties that we do, as well as an exploration of a couple different vintages that really shine out to us. So thanks everybody for being here. And if Mel and Ben want to introduce themselves as well and say hello.
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Ben Sherman. I'm the winemaker for Keuka Vineyards. I started here in August of 2020. So yeah, this upcoming vintage will be my 3rd vintage. And yeah, my first time working with Riesling and some of the hybrids that we make as well. So it was a fun experience getting to learn those for the first time. And yeah, that's a brief little intro. Yeah, we can talk more later too.
I'm Mel Goldman. Some of you know me. I run the vineyards, and as I always tell people, I unfortunately own the goddamn place. And you'll hear more from me later on. So why don't we get right down to the tasting?
All right, sounds good. I'm gonna go ahead and share.
Let me
my
also, before you go ahead, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Let me just introduce briefly the person who made the wines that we're tasting tonight, Katey Larwood, who is joining us, and she's a terrific winemaker. She is currently the winemaker at Damiani's, which makes some brilliant wines there, and I'm sure she's doing a fantastic job there, like she did here. And you know, it's going to be a pleasure tasting some of these wines after 7 years. So look forward. If you anytime, please, everybody, feel free to talk. I mean, this is meant to be participatory, not to be a lecture.
Yeah, this is definitely more of a discussion than it is us talking at you. And the more you feel comfortable speaking up and saying what you're tasting, what you're thinking, or asking questions, whether it's here talking verbally or in the little chat function, if you want to type out a question, feel free to ask away and make comments. This is a nice kind of stand-in for, instead of having everybody all in the same room, we're all in our own homes, but it's really nice to taste with this many people. So we're all glad you're all here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to go and do that. So presentation mode, let's go. Oh my goodness. Welcome. So we are doing a horizontal tasting of the 2015 Rieslings from Keuka Lek Vineyards. So you've already met everybody here. How this tasting is going to work, we're going to go ahead and invite you to first start off by pouring your sample of your Evergreen Lek if you have not started already. We're going to go ahead and go through each of these vineyards one at a time. We're going to talk a little bit about the vintage itself, the growing season, the details of what makes these wines so similar, but also so unique from one another, because it is all Riesling and they're all from the same year and from the same winemaker and all of those things, but they are, as you'll see, pretty different from one another. Why are we doing this? You know, why would we taste why would we taste 4 different Rieslings from 2015?
You can pour a sample of Evergreen Lek.
You know?
You should be in this class.
It is.
Okay.
Why we're doing this is to look at the notion of terroir. Terroir is kind of a complicated term. It's definitely a term that has a little bit of controversy behind it. Some people definitely believe in all of its implications and all of its impacts on the wine. And some people say, that's ridiculous, that's crazy, that's made up. So hopefully by the end of this tasting, you'll have a few opinions on what terroir means to Rieslings, the same grape by the same winemaker in the same year from the same, 5,200.
How do you know if your strip is on?
Oh. So go to the next slide. If you're not familiar with where we are, if you either haven't visited or just don't really know on the map where Keuka Lek Vineyards is, if you zoom all the way out to New York State, you can see over here was the Finger Lakes. They're named as such because they look like the fingers of a hand, scraped a bunch of lakes into the landscape. And here we are on Keuka Lek. So down here on this side, where the 2 branches come together on the base of the Y. Here we are, winery on the left-hand side, or the western slope, and we'll be referring to it as the western slope a fair bit. And then over here is the majority of our vineyard plantings, but not as much of our Riesling plantings on the eastern slope. So over here is about 6 acres of plantings on the western slope. And over here is about 30 acres of plantings on the eastern slope, with a big lake in the middle, but we're about the same latitude on either side of the lake.
About 6 acres of planting.
on the western slope and 30 acres of planting on the eastern slope with a big lake in the middle, but they're about the same latitude.
That is correct. Yeah.
More like 35 acres on the east side.
All right.
35 acres on the east side.
Uh-huh.
So if we zoom in on the western side, we can see here the little barn icon is where I'm currently sitting in the winery. You've got directly in front of us across from that parking lot that everyone's pretty
We
familiar
can
with.
see the fields. Here, you
Riesling.
can see what the fields are. This is on the west side.
Below
Okay, you
that.
can see Evergreen Lek is on the west side.
Whoever's echoing me, do you mind muting your microphone? So
Falling Man is also.
Right in front of them.
Goldman is also.
all right. And then over here is Evergreen Lek. And Evergreen Lek is beside a very large strand of evergreen trees, thus the name Lek coming from the Nepali term for highland. Is that correct, Mel? From a highland or a...
Highlands overlooking the lake, lake overlooking lake. Yes.
Okay. So you've got Goldman Riesling here, Falling Man Riesling below it, Evergreen Lek directly across. And you can see they're all really, really close to one another. And then across the road, you've got Ernesto Lucy. It's a lot of names, but good to keep in mind which ones are which and where they're all located, as it will definitely help you understand a bit more about just the significance of the differences in flavor, just with how close they all are. I am going to hand this over to Mel to talk a little bit about the growing year and the vintage itself.
Yes, this was, thank you for the slide and for the presentation, Katie.
No
The
problem.
slide, I mean, summarizes, this was this is the year 2015 that Katey Larwood, the winemaker that I just arrived here in April. And she arrived here in April and the lake was still frozen. It was the first year and it's the only year in the 25 years that we have lived here that the lake actually froze in front of Keuka Lake Vineyards. It normally freezes in the shallow portions on most years, but it doesn't freeze in the deep portions like sort of near Dr. Frank's and in front of our vineyards. We lost a lot of buds, including and not just buds, but we lost in the case of the Pinot Noir, we lost 33% of the plants. And then we lost a lot of buds. To give you an example, the production, as you can, of the Falling Man, as you can see on your sheet, in 2015 was 66 cases. The previous year, the 2014 vintage, we produced 175 cases. So that's how many buds we lost, or it's an approximation of what kind of bud loss we had. And the winter just lingered. We had snows in December, and unlike the norm in this area of the world, where it snows and then it melts and then it snows and it melts, the temperature tends to go up and down, but in this particular year, it stayed cold the whole winter season. And so bud break occurred a bit late, not very late. It was like around May 15th. I would say the average bud break in my, if I were to guess based on a few years of data, it's around May 11th. And in 2012, when we had no winter, bud break occurred on April 12th. And that led to the risk of severe frost. We're expecting, by the way, for this year, we're knock on wood, we're hopeful that we won't have bud break until early May. The year itself, as we got into the summer, it turned out to be kind of almost a normal year. It was a little bit, as Katie noted here, a little bit warmer than the typical year. And that warmth occurred kind of in the late summer. And that, as a matter of fact, led to an early harvest. You'll see from the dates on your harvest, which we'll talk about in a second. It was a rainy June, and most of the rest of the summer was dry, in contrast to 2018, the most disastrous year we've had so far, where we had a lovely, warm, dry May and June, and maybe the first part of July, and then all of a sudden the rain started coming and didn't stop. And it was a horrible, horrible harvest. The fall months were also hard. The fall months, is, if you can call September fall and early October. We had harvest, as you can see on your sheet. Both the Goldman and the Evergreen were harvested on the same day, October 3rd, which is very unusual. And in fact, the Goldman, I believe, Katey may remember better than me, Katey Larwood, that one of them was the Riesling harvest of our friends and family. The other one was done by our regular harvest crew. And that was on the 3rd of October, which is pretty early, given that the normal time is around Columbus Day weekend. So we can't complain about the quality of the season. And I guess we should get into Evergreen Lek and figure out what we think of it.
All right, guys. So first things first, have you poured your Evergreen Lek? If you haven't, please do and taste it. So our Evergreen Lek Vineyard is 1.6 acres of vines, and that was planted back in 1999. The clone that we are typically using in this region of the world is a clone called 239, and we'll talk a little bit more about the history of that later. But this vineyard is interesting. It kind of undulates from north to south towards the beginning of the lake with a small 5% grade, and then it gets even steeper towards its lowest point around 20%. The soil is quite unique. It's very rocky with lots of slate. So there's great drainage, and we typically get a consistent solid crop from this vineyard every year. And with the slate, we also see mix of glacial deposits that give the characteristic of minerality to this vineyard that we can expect from year to year. So that's one of the things that when I think about Evergreen Lek, I think about the minerality and the citrus backbone on this wine. And going to tasting it, just from appearance perspective, this wine has a very nice light yellow straw color, like the rest of the Rieslings from this vintage. But the aromatics there's a lot of lemon zest and mandarin and grapefruit, so that citrus is very much kind of at the forefront of the aromatic profile of this wine. And then we also see some secondary aromas of peach, almost a bit of coriander and some petrol, which is something that you do find in Rieslings particularly. Some people think that it's a fault, but it's actually, for the most part, to me, it comes from wines that have been trained and produced in a way that wines of high quality are made. So the petrol note comes from a molecule called TDN, and grapes that have low yields, later harvest, have really good sun exposure, a little bit of water stress. So often these vineyards are dry farmed, and also high acid content. All these characteristics lead to this production of precursors that give us that petrol note down the road. So something that I interpret as a mark of quality in Rieslings. So yeah, and then on the palate, this wine has a fantastic, really, really ripe peach. So we move from kind of having the citrus profile aromatically to having more of a fresh, ripe peach, really nice zippy lime, and this wine has really great body and texture as well. And yeah, I kind of wanted to call on the previous winemaker if we can. This being a kind of a tasting about terroir it'd be nice to kind of hear about your approach, Katey, in the cellar, if you don't mind, in regards to, did you approach your winemaking strategy with these vineyards differently? Were there different considerations amongst the vineyards, or was your approach very similar? And how that related to the different expressions of these Rieslings that we're tasting?
Geez, Ben, you're giving me a hard one.
All right. I think I just want to, because like in Burgundy, just to give you guys an example, I've had professors that said, if you don't understand terroir, or if you don't believe in terroir, go to Burgundy and taste your way through a bunch of wines from Burgundy, which are all made in the very same manner, same approach. And so there's not a lot of influence in the cellar. It's very much what's coming from the soil and from the land. So that's kind of what I was curious to know from what you did in 15 in the cellar.
Yeah, from what I remember about what I did in 15 was I always found it really fascinating that these vineyards are, they're right next to each other. So, it's a stone's throw to each of these blocks or these sites, and they're dramatically different from one another. And I'm really excited to taste through the whole lineup. But I think, kind of back to your Burgundy comment, it was mainly just let the site express itself. So a lot of the winemaking was very similar from vineyard to vineyard or site to site. So I do remember picking this vineyard. Mel mentioned that earlier, that we were doing the like the harvest picking party, or I can't remember how you called it, but Mel was leading the Goldman vineyard pick and I was leading the Evergreen Lek pick. So we were picking simultaneously. And I can't recall if we did multiple picks on Evergreen. I think we did multiple days. But yeah, just to kind of answer that, that's basically doing this, a very similar approach to the winemaking. And the vineyards are so dramatically different, and it was not necessarily a winemaking strategy.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so
I
that's
mentioned two innovations that I believe you brought, Katey, to the, I mean, this year as opposed to previous years, was that you field sorted.
Oh yeah.
That was she sat on the back of the tractor, and each of the trays that were picked by the crew were passed to Katey, and then and to her, if she sometimes had an assistant, and she would take out any rot or anything that wasn't perfect and then dump it. So that was to sort the good fruit so that it came in as very good. It was all hand-picked, of course. The other thing that I believe you did it in 15 as well as 16, Katey, was you whole cluster pressed.
Oh yeah.
And this was essential. I mean, it had only been done once or twice, 2 years before that, many years before, but it hadn't been done in a few years. But Katey chose, and it'd be interesting. Why did you choose to do it? Because I think it's a terrific. I know that Ben also agrees with that approach, but why did you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Ben has a similar reason for doing it. I think there's a lot of the rachises within the cluster kind of naturally help the berry in the press, so it's less aggressive on the berry when you're pressing it. Also, just destemming white wine, I feel like, or white grapes is just kind of unnecessary. But an interesting thing about the 15 vintage was that we didn't have a white press that vintage.
Oh, right.
So yeah, so that came in 60. So we were using our neighbors, which is another beautiful thing about the Finger Lakes, is that we can use our neighbors for support and help. So we were, at the at, I guess, the mercy of our friends and neighbors of when they could fit us into their press schedules. But yeah, I went back and looked at my notes, and I think we pressed the Evergreen Lek at Lakewood.
Oh,
Vineyards.
wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that was a long haul.
it
It's
is.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I forgot about that because it was only your second vintage in 2016 that
Yeah.
we got that really nice press.
Yes. It was an
And
upgrade.
and the new winery too.
Yeah.
We do have a question in the written chat, and the question is regarding the soil itself. Is there anything in the soil that's helping produce the beautiful acidity in this wine?
Well, I definitely think there's a lot of components. I think drainage and having, and the main determining factor is definitely going to be the cool climate in this region, and working with a grape variety that has an inherent high level of acidity. But definitely the cool climate, and then the slate is often attributed to a lot of that minerality that we experience in Riesling, and really good drainage helps with that. So I think it's a multi-pronged sphere of influence onto the acidity on the grapes for sure.
What if I could just add briefly to that? There was a research project done by a professor at the University of Massachusetts who had studied earlier at Cornell, and he came and he dug 3 deep holes each on Evergreen Lek and Falling Man. I think that's where the samples that Katie Cochran showed you earlier came from. He dug 3 feet down, 3 holes in each vineyard, one up, down, and middle, same, and he was trying to measure whether, what in the soils and what in the rocks gave the minerality and the different flavors. He was trying to figure that out. He came to the conclusion, because he tested the rocks and through measuring, for those of you not chemistry, the isotopes of the various minerals, he could tell what was passed through to the canes and then to the grapes and then to the wine. But the bottom line was he couldn't really find it in his study. He couldn't find the differences, because we knew that there are great differences between these 2 vineyards, but he was unable scientifically to determine. So whether we like to think that the acids come from something in the soils, but I mean, I don't know. Ben, you have more experience in different regions too. And Katey Larwood as well. It's hard to say.
For sure. Before we get lost in the details of all of this, why don't we move on to our next wine? There's plenty of wines to drink and lots of talking about soil, so I don't want us to get lost on the first one. So let's go ahead and move on to our Goldman Riesling. Bring this guy up, and we can just look real quick once again at our soil differences. This was the topsoil, the first 8 inches of the Evergreen Lek vineyard, and this is the 20 to 26 inch depth, and you can see the kind of mixture of soil types that we're talking about, and the rockiness, the slate, and all of that. But on to the next slide. This is actually a video of Goldman Vineyard on a pretty foggy morning last summer. And it's all the fog coming off the lake. So you can see how the lakes themselves create these really interesting cloud patterns and really interesting humidity patterns and weather patterns right here in Keuka.
Yeah, great. So this vineyard is slightly smaller than Evergreen at 1.3 acres. And it was planted in 98. And there's a mix of clones that were planted there. But as Mel was saying, they're probably all 239 by now, because this area has some propensity to for vine death due to it being flatter, and there's not a lot of wind flow. And I think there's some accumulation of cool air, particularly during periods of the winter that are very, very cold, like in 15. And so the soil here is similar to Evergreen, but there's a lot more gravel and a bit of quartz with some pockets of clay. And some of the soils have some silty loam that have been formed from glacial till, and a lot of large stone fragments that have been stratified over time. And I remember when we were planting vines there last spring, we were just coming across these massive pieces of stone, and yeah, it was quite an arduous situation, and it was much different from what we experienced in Evergreen. That soil had more slate. It was easier to drill through with an auger. But yeah, so that's a little bit about the soil. I would definitely love some participation on tasting this wine, guys. There's something very distinctive about this aromatic profile that's very different from Evergreen. What do you guys think? Or what are you guys smelling?
And feel free to speak up. You're more than welcome to all interject and say what you're smelling and tasting. There's no wrong answers. I know in our first tasting, somebody was saying they tasted pine sol and apple candy, and those are great tasting notes too.
I think it's more apple than peach on the Goldman.
Yeah, and there's even starting to get some honeyed character as well. And I think that could maybe come from the age of this wine. But it definitely gets kind of that tart green apple, particularly on the palate, with again that citrus backbone, lemon, a little bit of lime zest. But there's definitely some more fresh peach, maybe a little bit of like apricot confiture jam, which I think comes from the maturation in bottle.
It's not as zippy as the Evergreen.
So if you look at your tasting notes, that could be due to the amount of residual sugar. So this wine has the highest amount of sugar across the spectrum of wines that we're tasting today. So
7 GO, 7 grams.
Yeah, and when you look at the amount of acid, there is a significant amount of acid on this wine.
Yeah.
So for those who are looking at the tasting sheet, the units we're using for residual sugar, or RS, you'll see that's listed in grams per liter. So it's 4 grams of sugar per liter for the Evergreen Lek, and not 7 grams per liter sugar in the Goldman. Residual sugar meaning the sugar that's not fermented, so leftover sugar. And then you're looking as well, TA is one of the indicators of acid, pH is the other one. So pH is a scale, it's a bit complicated, it's logarithmic. So a difference between 3 and 4 is actually tenfold rather than onefold. But a higher number is going to be less acidic. So the lower the number, the more acidic. So you're looking at the pH of Goldman is 3.01 compared to the pH of Evergreen is 3.31. So even though you're getting more of that perceptible zippiness, more of that perceptible tartness in the Evergreen, the acid is actually higher in the Goldman. It's 9.2 grams per liter of TA and a pH of 3.01. And as Ben said, that's definitely due to the residual sugar creating more of a balance. So when you perceive sugar, you're not going to, or when you have sugar present, you're not going to perceive that acid as intense as you would when it's a drier wine with less sugar.
The international, I think it's called Riesling Foundation, considers a wine dry if the, a simple definition, if the acid is greater than the amount of sugar, just very simply. So here you have the Goldman TA, your acid is 9 grams and your sugar is 7 grams. That means it's a dry wine. If the sugar exceeded the acid, then you'd consider it a medium dry, or we'd call it a semi-dry wine.
Right.
One of the big differences, it's interesting, and I don't know whether Katey Larwood would recall it, but I'm looking at the text sheet for the Evergreen Lek, and at harvest, it had very low acidity, much lower than typical for Riesling. I mean, for our Riesling, 6.8 grams per liter and 3.2 roughly of pH, as opposed to Goldman, which had 10.3 grams of acid and 3 pH, and so it's surprising. They're right next to each other. Why would they have such different acidity? I mean,
Could have been my poor titration skills as well.
oh, that's not true.
6.8 seems quite low to me.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
All the up and Falling Man is, I think, 9.5 or something.
Mhm. Yeah, it is significant that the proximity of the two vineyards that we're tasting right now are to one another, and the fact that they were harvested on the same day. It is interesting that they do taste so different. And if you have your glasses side by side, you can really, see like a stark difference in the nose and the flavor. That have comments, there's a comment,
Mhm.
That's all right.
I got a question.
Sure.
If you were to eat the grape when just before or at harvest time, would you notice the difference between varieties?
Difference between the vineyards?
The difference between the
Does it
taste?
taste different fruit from different vineyards?
Yes.
Yes, different. Would you really notice the difference in taste between different vineyards?
Great question, Mel. You want to field that one?
Thanks a lot, Ben. I think what I'd be able to say to that is, if we were tasting and pardon me, Katey Larwood, if we were tasting a Riesling vineyard on Seneca Lake, I think I could taste the difference, but I'm not sure I could taste the grape difference necessarily. I could see that there may be some differences, but I wouldn't be able to taste the series. It would be very difficult. I would find it difficult.
And Mel, can you elaborate a little further into the detail as to the reasons why?
No, I mean, I could, in terms of,
Well, what I'm getting at is it one of the defining features of wines from around Keuka Lake, and particularly our property, is that these wines have an elevated level of acidity. So when you look at the tech sheets and the chemistry, they're always a bit more acidic than Seneca. So if you were to taste the fruit from Seneca and Keuka Lake, they would be tartar. They would have similar amounts of sugar, but there would be more acid. And I think that's one.
that's the reason that I tasted
of wines from Keuka Lake Vineyards and probably some surrounding vineyards along this lake.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I would, I would add to that if you look at Cornell, we're very privileged around here. Cornell Cooperative Extension does a superb job with providing assistance, guidance, and every year we get around harvest time a set of each week a newsletter that's called from Veraison to Harvest, and they do analyses of grapes all over New York State, but they do some on Seneca. For Riesling, they do some on Seneca and some on Keuka and different lakes. And so if you watch the way the numbers move in terms of sugars and acids, typically, and that's my experience, is that the sugar levels in Keuka Lake will move in roughly the same as Seneca Lake or Cayuga Lake, but the acids will not come down as fast as the acids on Seneca Lake. Don't ask me why, but that seems to be the, and that's what pans out. And I think, thank you, Ben, for your question. That was, I think that really is a fundamental difference in Keuka Lake versus Seneca and Cayuga Lake.
So we have a pair of questions here in the comments that I think go well together. There's one question from when we were discussing Evergreen, really asking about the slope, whether that helps a lot with the drainage and the acid production or the acidity. And there's a follow-up question asking about the differences between the plants themselves, i.e. the year they were planted, and potentially the health of the plants or the location. And I feel like that kind of, those two questions are almost connected in how the plants grow and the slope and the positioning of the soil or of the vineyards themselves. What do you guys think about the individual plants themselves and their growth compared to the developed flavors between these vineyards?
Yeah, so I'm gonna start with the slope question. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's a fantastic thing. There are a lot of reasons for planting on a slope or on a hillside. One is you get great aspect and exposure to sunlight, particularly if you're pointed towards a particular direction. It can dictate whether or not you want to plant certain varietals there, and one varietal may be more conducive to another. And also drainage is very important. So you can have issues with vine growth and the health of the vine if there isn't very good drainage. I mean, the vines just they won't grow very well, and they'll eventually die. They pretty much they drown essentially. There's epoxia in the soil, and so that's important for the health of the vine. Also during the winter, as we talked a little bit earlier about Goldman having some issues with vine injury and death. And one of the reasons for that is that the vineyard's quite flat. And so during really cold winters, you'll have some accumulation of cold air, and on a slope, you don't have that. So that cold air will actually kind of fall down and move through that vineyard. And so the temperature, I think, doesn't descend as far as it would if it was just kind of accumulating in, say, a little knoll or something like that. Hopefully that makes sense.
So if you think of the premier Riesling regions in the world after the Finger Lakes, of course, Alsace and Germany and Austria, they're traditionally planted on very steep slopes. You look at the Mosel. I mean, our slopes are nothing compared to theirs, and on the Rhine as well.
Yeah.
And it would seem to me that there's a good reason. And on ours, if you look at mortality rates in these three vineyards that we're tasting today, the lowest mortality rate is on Falling Man, the second lowest on Evergreen, and the third, the worst, in other words, is Goldman. And I think that speaks to the slope.
Yeah,
I understand you to say these are all in the same rootstock and the same clone is grafted to it. So they're identical in terms of the genetics of the fruit producing vine.
yes, you would be correct. Yeah.
Okay. I have a second question. These are very uniquely distinct. We haven't opened the third and fourth yet, or the third for sure. But when you look at these things as a chemist and you run them through a GC mass spec, are you seeing vast differences in the ester contents that are producing these unique flavors?
I imagine that you would. We haven't done that, but we can send you samples if you give us your address there, Glenn. That's okay.
Wait, seriously, we'd love to do that.
Group chat.
If anybody wants to run GC or HPLC on our wines, that would be phenomenal. And even on the juice pre-fermentation and then the wines to see, what pre-fermentation flavors you can taste the differences of versus post-fermentation flavors would be fascinating to see.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I'll just take this to the basement and run it right now.
CMS, absolutely. So glad you have one of those. It's crazy.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, let's hop on over to the next one, Falling Man.
This is going to be interesting. Falling Man.
Where did we get the name?
Isn't it? It is.
Falling Man, what is this?
guys can share that we get.
With the Falling Man, I do want to start by saying that photos really do not capture the angle of this hill, the slope of this hill. This vineyard is deceptively steep. So this is a photo taken from the top, so you can kind of see the beginning of it, and you can see Evergreen Lek behind it off to the left, but it really doesn't capture the slope and steepness of this vineyard. And so I got one more photo. I ran down the hill and tried to capture it. That's from below. And so you can see it really does drop off. But again, you know, a phone or a wide angle camera just does not capture just how steep it is. So anytime that you guys come and visit us, please, we have some picnic tables overlooking Falling Man, and you really do get a sense for the drama of that slope. And then if you really are up to it, you can go ahead and walk down, turn around, and look at what you just put yourself into, having to walk back up that hill again. It's fairly dramatic.
All right, yeah, so Falling Man Vineyard. So this is the smallest of the three at 1.1 acres. Vineyard was planted in 2001. And again, it's the same clone of Riesling. And as we've been talking about slope, this vineyard it has like a 20-degree slope in some places, or more than a 20-degree slope, I should say. And when you're on a tractor, it's very evident and it can be quite scary at times. And but you really understand where the name comes from when you're on a tractor driving across this vineyard. But some defining characteristics is that the soils drain extremely well. So we're going to get some water stress, some beneficial water stress. We'll probably get that increased concentration of those molecules that give the wine the petrol note. And we get really good fruit flavor concentration here. There's a lot of gravel amongst this glacial till here. So I think Falling Man is very much characterized by the intensity of the acidity and the minerality. And again, those fruit flavors. So as you see here, this is the topsoil is on the left. So you can see it's a little bit darker in color, a little bit more organic matter. And then this is, how far down is this, Katey? The right plate?
26 to 20 to 26 inches.
20 to 26, okay. Yeah, so there we start to see the larger stones, larger gravel, and less organic content matter in the soil. Yeah.
How far do the roots go down?
That is a great question. I don't know if any soil pits have been done except for the gentleman that came by to do the study, Mel, but since they're 21 years of age, I mean, I would say they can be over 20 feet deep.
Wow.
Yeah, 15 to 20 feet deep, yeah.
Way deep. Whatever it is, it's way deep.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know if Katey Larwood, if you have any experience doing soil pits in the Finger Lakes. If you do, that'd be great to hear from you.
I do not, unfortunately, but
Okay.
I do remember there being, I can't remember which site it was, Mel, but there being bedrock pretty close to the topsoil. So I always found that fascinating that, like, specifically Keuka Lake vineyards are just sitting on kind of a shelf of rock. So
Yeah.
How far down?
from what I remember, I don't remember what the vineyard was, but I remember there being some sort of soil map, or maybe I dreamed this up and it was a fantasy, but there was, I think it was like 10 feet.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing about the Finger Lakes, though, is the soils are so dramatic and different, even within the same area. So you could have bedrock 10 feet in one area, and then you'll never see it again for a while. So
Yeah. And I'm sure everybody who's been here is at least a little bit familiar with the gully that runs directly south of the vineyards, directly south of Goldman and Falling Man. just down that slope, it's all rock immediately. As soon as the stream rips through, it drops off to a rock face pretty quickly. So I'm sure towards the southern end of these vineyards, there's a fair bit of just direct bedrock right there. And it's crazy too, if you ever do go down on the lower road below the winery on the 54A, that's the one?
Yep. Yep.
You can see all these little streams coming down, and you can see how they just carve through these layers of shale. And it's just very, very evident that we're on just a rock face, essentially. And it's kind of wild to imagine that there's so many successful vineyards just right on top of all of that pretty much entirely rock.
Interesting.
So what do you guys think about the wine? Are you picking up any differences from its aromatic profile or from the way it feels on the palate, the acidity, the texture, some of those fruit, some of the predominant fruit flavors?
Seems a little lighter or less sweet than the other two.
Definitely, yeah. It feels drier for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I get almost like a tactile sensation of minerality, kind of like a really fine chalkiness as well. Again, like that zippy lime, little bit of like white peach and grapefruit.
That's the truth.
Yeah, I think the texture is really special in this wine. It's what sets it apart from the other ones. There's that chalky minerality that's fantastic.
What is it on the nose that
Yeah.
something wonderful that I can't characterize?
Well, it's petrol to me. It's more like that too.
Always got like a lot of jasmine tea from the site.
Mhm. Jasmine tea. Mhm.
Can you smell the jasmine?
No.
I can't.
Almost a tea with an orange peel or something. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's delicious.
So it's interesting that this is also, I mean, it's also right next to the Evergreen. It's below the Goldman, but it's right next to the Evergreen. And yet again, they're so different.
Yeah, definitely.
In a vineyard that has that kind of slope to it, which obviously impacts the sunlight on the plants also, would you get differences if you harvested and vented from different sides of the same vineyard?
Yeah, and maybe different altitudes as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I mean, up and down the slope of the thing, yeah.
Yeah, if there's significant differences in temperature and sun exposure, absolutely, yeah. And that's a practice that's a lot often is standard, doing multiple passes in a vineyard. And as you begin to understand that vineyard more and kind of the ripening patterns due to those reasons, you pick accordingly to that. Yeah.
So this vineyard was picked all on the same day. So this is inherently a blend in itself.
Yeah, and you'll and ripeness within a cluster isn't homogeneous either. So you could pluck a couple berries within a cluster and they would have different levels of sugar and acidity, generally speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's I mean, you even see that when you're leading up to harvest, you're picking different berries from throughout the vineyard to test your sugars and test your acids, and you intentionally pull berries from kind of all over the place in a pretty randomized sampling, but in that it's like you don't want it all to come from the same little space because you're going to get that micro region to micro region, little zone to zone, cluster to cluster, vine to vine variation. And so to get a better understanding of how the overall vineyard is ripening, you want to pull fruit from all over the place rather than from a few plants here and a few plants there. So you're absolutely spot on there with that assumption that if you were to look at one corner of the vineyard or one specific vine or one specific plant, you would get completely different results.
Great question.
Mhm. So we have to do that kind of thing, Ben, maybe play around with one of the vineyards, do multiple passes and make the wine. I mean,
Yeah, we have a vineyard called 20 Rows, and it's 4 acres, and there's distinct ripening differences amongst this whole plot. And as you move towards the tree line, ripeness decreases, and the opposite is true when you move towards the road, generally speaking. So, and it's pretty flat. So there aren't great differences in altitude, but from north to south, from the road to the forest line, there are distinct differences in acidity and ripeness. Yeah.
there are differences in soil, however. It goes from sandy soil on that north side, the gully side, to gravelly on the roadside with some clay right in the middle. So you have the combination, I think, what you're saying. You have combination of the sun and the impact of the sun as well as the soils. It'd be very interesting to do that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
Shall we move to the final wine?
Sure.
Here we go.
This is a blend.
Yep. No, just the Evergreen Lek. That's the only.
17% from Ernesto. 65%.
You can see here on the map, we've got 2 different blocks. So in that first map where you saw the lake cutting through the middle, we have the Western vineyards where you have your Ernesto Lucy, your Goldman, your Evergreen, your Falling Man. And then on the eastern side, we have 2 different Riesling vineyards, the Upper East Side and the Lower East Side. So the Upper East Side is obviously higher up in elevation on the hill, a little bit further east, a little bit further away from the lakes, and the Lower East Side is further down. None of the Lower East Side made it into this dry Riesling blend. I'm guessing the assumption is that it went into the semi-dry, but you can see here 65% of the Evergreen Lek, the dry Riesling is comprised of 65% Evergreen Lek, 17% Ernesto Lucy, and 18% Upper East Side Riesling.
I think the practice that during Katey's time is the same as the current practice, which is after we blind taste the individual vineyards and decide which vineyard is going to be a single vineyard, or at least part of it will be a single vineyard. And then the remainder, different blends are prepared by the winemaker and tasted blind to determine which one should go into the dry Riesling and which one should go into the semi-dry Riesling. Do you recall that effort, Katey Larwood?
Yep, same way.
Same way.
So back to a question on harvesting. Do you determine the day of harvest by the sugar and acid content of a blend of grapes off of each of these vineyards? What determines the harvest date?
Good question. So yes, chemistry definitely is important, and we analyze the fruit every couple of days when we're getting within the range of what we would call ideal conditions, chemistry speaking. And for me, when you look at the chemistries on your sheet, those are perfect for me. But also we're in the vineyard tasting, every day, and we want to determine if a lot of different things. We want to make sure that the fruit is tasting as best as it can, and the seeds are mature, and so the seeds will begin to brown and begin to become crunchy and take on a certain kind of almondy flavor. And we're looking for that. We're looking for signs of that. When you crush the berry in your skin, we're looking for dissociation of the pulp and the skin quite easily. Liberation of juice as well as you crush it between your fingers. And also, disease pressure is very influential. So if you're starting to see some signs of botrytis, which often is a welcome sign, then we're getting ready to harvest very, very soon. And if weather isn't conducive to arresting that development of botrytis in the vineyard, then we're going to pick really fast, because botrytis blooms can happen and pretty much encapsulate your whole berry cluster, and you're not left with much viable fruit. So yeah, definitely chemistries are great, and we know when we start to test those berries, and then as we're sampling, we're tasting the fruit at the same time. We're getting an idea of flavor in the mouth and some of the physiological aspects, like the seeds and the skins and things, and also disease pressure. Those are kind of like the three attributes that influence us as winemakers. Yeah.
If you have any Evergreen Lek left over, it would be really interesting for you to pour a little bit more of the Evergreen, so you can make a comparison with the Dry Riesling, because the biggest component of the Dry Riesling is the Evergreen. And here you get a view of what blending is all about, because they're so different.
My initial observation is that the blending has tempered the petrol of the Evergreen. It has tempered it quite significantly.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also a depth to the 2015 that the dry blend that the Evergreen doesn't quite have.
Yeah, I find that a little bit of that chalky minerality is more evident on the dry than it is on the Evergreen. It's more fresh peach fruit on the Evergreen, and this has that kind of really nice minerality citrus backbone going for it. Yeah.
I didn't get quite as much peach as I expected to in the blend.
Mm-hmm.
So not to put Katey Larwood on the spot again, but we have a few little questions. Just to ask about the general experience of the 2015 vintage, and this being your first vintage in the Finger Lakes as the winemaker here. What was the impression of coming to this region, and what was it like as a winemaker coming from Southern Hemisphere to the Finger Lakes? What was that like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm originally from California, so this was very different from what I was used to. But I think the thing that I think struck me, apart from everything being very green all around you all the time, was how things ripened. And Ben kind of talked about this a little bit ago, but how the acids were so well retained in these wines as they were ripening and developing sugars. Those acids held on, and kind of to Ben's point earlier, that is very unique, I think, to Keuka Lake within the Finger Lakes. So you're talking about very different, we're in the same region, but different lakes do different things. But I think overall the vintage was amazing. It was my first one there and first one in the Finger Lakes, so a lot of learning. A lot of learning, but very fun. Yeah,
you did an amazing job, considering the fact that we didn't have a really good press. We didn't have a lot of things that you should have had, and yet you managed pretty well.
Well,
Yeah.
I think a lot of things. I mean, Ben's probably still doing this too now. Is it's, you just have to figure it out. great. You're here to make the wine. You have this product and you have this these grapes, and that's your job. So you call all your neighbors and your friends. You ask them for for some press time.
Yeah.
When did the blend actually take place? When were these three wines blended into this dry Riesling? Recently or 5 years ago?
Probably
Oh.
May of 2016, May or June of 2016.
So you were sure by that time that you had developed all the characteristics that we're seeing right now in these aged bottles?
That's an interesting question.
I think you try to speculate. So
Yeah, okay.
if I was to go to the cellar right now and taste the wines in a young state, they're going to be a lot different than they will be in a year, so to say. So what we try to do as winemakers is try to kind of foresee the future a bit, and we try to utilize the strengths of all the different vineyards to try to get a certain expression of Riesling that we're trying to find. So we blend a lot of components together and do different variations of different percentages of each vineyard, and we look at the aromatics, we look at the flavor profile, the acidity profile, the freshness and intensity of flavor. We try to find the best blend for what we're trying to make. So often case number is also important. So if we want to make 500 cases of a certain wine, we may have a certain volume of wine to work with, and that can influence the blend as well. So ultimately, we're trying to find the best absolute expression of a dry Riesling from our estate through blending those different components. And that happens. We did ours already, and we started doing that first week in April. So we tasted through all the different lots. We gave them certain ratings and marked down what we thought were important and what contributions were given from each vineyard into the blend. And then we played around with certain percentages, and we tasted through everything blind and try to determine what's the best route and what's the best representative Riesling for our property.
So at 6 years, where are we in the life of this bottle that we now have in our fridge?
Good question.
We're exactly right.
Glenn. Hold on to it. I mean, I like the way it's tasting right now, and I like when wines are still very fresh, but also start to develop some secondary characteristics.
Yeah.
So a little bit of honey, some of that fresh fruit flavor starting to dry out a bit, and that's where I like to drink my wines.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a wine that's age worthy, and these Rieslings, which they definitely are, age worthy. So yeah, I mean they taste great. 1 year old, and then they're different experience. You drink them 5 to 6 to 7 years of age, and then even more so, another 5 or 10 years down the road. So
what happens to that petrol flavor over? I never really noticed it so much until this tasting, until you even mentioned it. But what happens to that flavor over time? The petrol.
Yeah. So I think it becomes more developed, and that might be due to some other chemistries happening. But drinking older Rieslings, I find that the petrol note becomes a little bit more pronounced.
It becomes more pronounced. I was wondering if it's smooth.
But it's not like it's being generated in the bottle.
Right.
Those precursors, they're called terpenes. They're in the skins, and they started in the skins, and they make their way into the wine. So there might be some chemical reactions taking place that make those terpenes, the TDNs, be more prevalent from an aromatic perspective. But I don't know, and I don't know if it's even known what happens to those GDNs, but Glenn's going to help us again with his mass spec.
Right on that.
We're going to get to the bottom of this, Mark. Don't worry.
It varies from year to year in terms of that petrol aroma, and it has to do a lot with when you leaf pull. We pull the leaves off, let the grapes air, and depending to a certain extent on when you pull it and how warm the season is, you get more of those. But as Ben said, over time, I mean, I just know from one experience of two early vintages of ours, the '05 and the '07, that we got a period of time when those petrol aromas were overwhelming, and I didn't particularly care for it. And then they backed down and they became quite delicious again. So yeah, that's just experiential. I don't know.
Yeah. So do you use a yeast? I mean, do you pitch this with the yeast? I mean, is it like a specific kind of yeast? Is it your own? Is it some?
So Katey, you could confirm, but I think, so there's a yeast strain that I've used this yeast strain, and I believe maybe Katey has used it as well, but it's called RHST, and it's a yeast strain that has been isolated in Austria, that's been used for Riesling for quite some time. And it's fantastic. You can pitch it at very low temperatures, and it just cruises along, and you don't have to worry about stuck fermentations. It ferments quite clean, and you get a lot of the fruit flavors that we're looking to really punch out in Riesling from the RHS.
You said low temperature, so it's almost like a lager yeast. You could have a 40 degree and it'll ferment.
If I remember correctly, the threshold is 50 degrees for this yeast, and it'll probably go underneath 50, but the recommendation is you don't want to go under 50 degrees. And I think looking at Katey's notes, that those ferments went at about 52 degrees Fahrenheit. So nice and slow, slow and low. And you couldn't do that with other yeast strains, I don't think. I mean, with a lot you could, but some wouldn't do well under those conditions. So I think those wines were all pitched with RHST. I don't know, maybe Katey can talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think they were, I may have used, I think X5, not to get in the weeds here, but yeah, I guess it's also important when you're choosing your yeast strain to factor in your pH. So a lot of yeasts don't like very, very low pHs, and these are all very low pHs. So
yeah,
RHST is it's like almost like a sparkling wine yeast.
So if you were gonna age one of these, which one would you age of these bottles? Is there one you could pick and say, I'm gonna age that one?
Mel, you want to field that question?
I was going to ask you a different question and come back to that if that's okay. Since we're on yeasts, you might want to explain what your pied de coupe, what you've been doing, what you've been attempting in the last couple of years and trying to, and what we're doing more and more of in terms of yeast.
Yeah, so
inoculation, I should say.
Yeah. So there's a winemaking term called pied de cuve, and it means the foot of the tank. And it's a way to build a culture from the vineyard. So we've, like Katey and myself, and particularly Katey, building these cultures in the lab, we wanted to start experimenting with the indigenous yeast populations that are found on the surface of the grape berries. So what we do is we go out and harvest some grape clusters, and we crush them, and they go into a large jar and sits in our lab at a nice temperature. And we eventually start to see some natural fermentation taking place. And then we begin to build that culture over time. And we have various different cultures going, and we smell them and taste them. And if some of them aren't healthy, they don't end up being built up. And if some of them have really amazing aromatics and we're really excited about those, then we say, okay, that's the one. And so we start to build and double that volume, and we get this nice rip roaring fermentation going in our lab. And then when grapes are harvested, and just right before we would inoculate with commercial yeast, we have about 5 to 10% of that tank's volume already fermenting naturally somewhere, and then we pitch that over top. So that's kind of been something that we've been experimenting with last year, and we'll experiment again with this year, and just trying to get some consistent results with the natural yeast in the area, and to see what that gives us. So
Yeah. To add to that, also, I know there's always a lot of concern with native yeast in disease pressure heavy year. And one of the things that we're doing with this P2Q style is you're being very selective with the clusters that you're picking. So you're going through the vineyard and very much picking, free clusters or picking out any of the diseased berries that might be in there, because you're really trying to pick fruit that doesn't have any potential spoilage to create vinegar or have other off aromas, because what you're looking to get is that native yeast that's on the skins of the fruit. But there's also going to be what's called acetobacter, which is the vinegar creating bacteria on these fruits as well. And acetobacter needs oxygen to create vinegar. And so if you already have broken berries, you already have rotting berries, that means you have an oxygen rich environment where these microbes can get in there and start consuming the sugars and making vinegar, as well as, your yeast having alcohol production. And so you're being incredibly selective, going through the vineyard saying, these berries look great, these clusters look great. So only the best fruit is making your native ferment start. Because again, part of that notion of terroir does have a microbial element to it as well. You've got, what lives in the soil, what lives on the vines, those yeast and bacteria that come back year in, year out. There's now a lot of research into these mycorrhizal networks that are in the soil. So it's your fungal networks between plant roots. And so there's a lot of microbial factors as well as just soil factors and weather factors. And so when you're doing these Pied de Cuve and native yeast ferments, you're really thinking about, okay, how can I make sure that the bacteria and yeast that we're putting into our wine is only going to be creating favorable components and not, VA or vinegar or things like that that are just unappealing and not tasting good.
Interesting.
When you crush these grapes, do you leave the juice on the skins for any appreciable period of time, or are they crushed and pressed immediately?
So for the Pied de Cuve, yes, you're leaving it on the skins because that's where you're getting the microbes from. But for the wines themselves, no.
Crush and press. Yeah.
But winemakers do some maceration with white grapes. That is something that happens. It's just not something that we do at KLV unless we're trying to make a skin fermented wine where we're fermenting 100% on the skins. Mm-hmm. There are winemakers that will do, a few days of maceration on the skins with the hopes to build, texture and body and to extract a little bit of phenolic character
and color
the wine. Yeah. But it's not something that we do at Keuka Lake Vineyards. Yeah.
We still haven't answered Mark's question about which wine would be best to age. And I think we're trying to evade it, but I don't think there's a definitive answer. I think that, I have a personal bias. I think that, and that has to do with acidity to a certain extent. And the Falling Man is the most acidic. And I just have the feeling that you could leave this for 50 years and it would be a good wine. I'm not sure it would be your favorite in 10 years or 20 years. One of the others might evolve in a way that attracts you more. But that would be but what, would you have any different view, Ben or Katie or Katie?
I think all the wines have great aging potential.
Yeah.
And also, I think there's a misunderstanding too about the ageability of white wines. And I think Rieslings have kind of shown, especially around here, that they do age beautifully.
I think Ben's answer.
I was curious because the Evergreen is so, of all of them, it's the most kind of fruity, like Ben said. It's got those citrus notes all over it, and you can taste the lime. And I was wondering if that wouldn't age as well as the others, which seem to be deeper.
This was the first one we tasted. This was the second one, third one.
So it's just like, each one.
Yeah, no, it's a tough question for sure.
Yeah,
I'll buy them all and age them, right?
I mean, I don't know.
I'm
I
just
don't
curious.
think we know, but that Evergreen is the least acidic of all.
Right.
And as you say, least deep of all of them. So can you would you be ready to say I'll be there in 10 years and we'll taste them all again?
What?
Of course, your palate changes over time. Everything. Thank you.
Do we have any, I mean, I feel like that's such a speculative question, not speculative question, but a non-definitive answer. Do we have any other questions that we haven't touched on yet before we kind of call it a night?
Oh, before you call it a night, question for everybody. Do you have a favorite?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
All right. Well, we start from left to right in our room here, so.
I'll go with the dry Riesling. I think it has a nice balance. It's really a good sipping wine. I can see it go with many different dishes. I'm not sure how it would age, but then again, I don't let any of my wines age, so. Personal preference. Thank you. Yours.
Sue?
I'm gonna ditto him. I do like the blend. It's very, very nice. And again, we don't let things sit too long.
I tend not to let things sit either, but I like the Goldman. I'm surprised that a 2015 has such nice body to it. I'm a little more, I like sweeter things, I guess. Oh, and
That's it.
all four. Anyone?
I like the dry Riesling to age, but I would like another case of Evergreen.
I think the Falling Man's going to age the best, but that Evergreen I think right now is the most fun to drink right now.
Yeah, quaffable.
I like the Goldman to start with, but after getting the dry Riesling, that ended up being my favorite.
Yes. Yes.
It's interesting.
My favorite's dry Riesling, yeah.
Anybody else?
Question is, will the 2022 dried Riesling taste the same as the 2015 dried Riesling?
For sure not.
Sure.
What about the winemaker of these wines? Do you have a favorite?
Ouch.
They're all good. They're all good.
I love the Falling Man and the Evergreen, I think are my two favorites tonight. But
It's great.
Good.
Oh, what was
That
that?
was Bob's
That
favorite.
the dog.
Our dogs are barking at the neighbors.
I thought he was picking a wine.
I thought they were agreeing. They like the Falling Man and Evergreen the best.
Yeah, they might.
Well, thank you everybody so much for joining us tonight. It was a really, really wonderful chat, and what a fun way to kind of explore these teeny tiny differences in spatial, placement, but pretty large differences in the fine wines. Thanks so much again for making this series such a fun experience for all of us. We really love doing these in the cooler parts of the year when it's not as easy to have everybody join us at the winery. So this makes the winter and the early spring pretty special for us.
We enjoy it a lot. So thank you so much for offering them.
Yeah, of course. And thanks, Katey Larwood, for joining us tonight. This was such a treat to talk to the winemaker from the vintage that we're.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you all. Thanks, Katie.
Hope you
That was
guys do
great.
it again.
Thanks for such good wines too.
Damiani soon.
yes, please come over. Thank you, Katie, Ben, Mel. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions too, and
Thanks.
Night.
great night.
Good night.
Good night,
Good
guys.
night.
Thank you.
Bye,
Nice
everybody.
seeing you.
Good night.